It was one of those rare, perfect mornings where everything seemed to align quiet, peaceful, and calm. The sunlight filtered gently through the curtains, casting soft beams of light onto the living room floor. Clara stood by the kitchen counter, sipping her coffee, enjoying the warmth of the cup in her hands. Outside, the city was waking up. The hustle and bustle still distant enough for Clara to savor this stillness. The kind of stillness she had come to cherish on Sundays, especially after a demanding work week at her graphic design job. Her husband, Daniel, still slept soundly in the next room, the steady rhythm of his snores a comforting reminder of the life they had built together. Their apartment, a small but cozy space in the city, was filled with the little things that made it feel like home. The mismatched furniture, the soft throw blankets scattered across the couch, and the books they had collected over time. For Clara, Sundays meant peace, a moment to recharge before the busy week ahead. But as she glanced over at the clock, she couldn't help but smile at the thought of what was waiting for them beyond the city. The Dacha, that small cottage in the countryside, was more than just a house to Clara. It was a sanctuary, a place she could escape to, where the worries of city life faded into the background. It had belonged to her grandmother, who had passed it down to Clara after she was gone. As a child, Clara had spent countless summers there, running through fields of wildflowers, climbing trees, and listening to the stream nearby as it babbled its way through the meadow. The smell of freshly baked bread that always seemed to fill the air, and the comfort of sitting by the fire on chilly evenings, had all been part of the cottage's magic. And now, it was Clara's. She and Daniel had made memories there, so many weekends spent enjoying the peace of the land, away from the stress of everyday life. The phone rang, cutting through Clara's daydreams. She set the coffee mug down, glancing at the screen. Margaret. Her heart sank a little at the sight of the name. Margaret, her mother-in-law, wasn't the warmest person. The two of them had always had a strained relationship. Margaret was polite, but there was a coldness in her tone that Clara could never quite ignore. It was clear Margaret only tolerated her for Daniel's sake. Clara had tried to be respectful, but Margaret's sharp tongue and controlling nature often made Clara feel small, like she was walking on eggshells. Still, she answered the call. "Good morning." "Margaret," Clara said, forcing a polite tone. She knew this conversation would be difficult. It always was. But Margaret didn't return the pleasantries. Her voice was clipped, direct, like someone who had something important to say and didn't have time for small talk. "Clara," Margaret's voice cut through the line, "I need you to listen carefully. Tomorrow, Monday at 10 a.m. We're meeting at the notary. I'm selling the Dacha. I've already taken the advance payment from the buyers. You just need to show up and sign the documents." Clara's world seemed to stop. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. The Dacha sold. How could this be happening? Her fingers tightened around the phone as she tried to make sense of what Margaret had just said. The cottage was hers. It was part of her family's legacy. It wasn't just a house. It was a place that held memories, history, and now, Margaret was telling her that it had already been sold without her consent. The shock left Clara speechless. Her mind raced, trying to process the impossible situation. How could Margaret do this? Why would she even consider selling something that wasn't hers to sell? The Dacha wasn't just a property, it was Clara's connection to her grandmother, to her past. And yet, Margaret had already made arrangements. It felt like a betrayal so deep. Clara couldn't even find the words to express it. Clara's grip on the phone tightened, her fingers trembling as the words echoed in her mind. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to confront Margaret about the absurdity of her claim. But instead, her voice came out shaky, barely above a whisper. What are you talking about?" Margaret Clara's voice cracked with a mix of confusion and rising anger. "The Dacha is mine. It was my grandmother's. You can't just sell it. You don't have the right." There was a long pause on the other end, and for a brief moment, Clara hoped Margaret would back down, maybe apologize for some kind of mistake. But when Margaret spoke again, her tone was colder than ever. "I already have the buyers lined up. They're a lovely couple who've been searching for a countryside retreat. The deal is done. You don't need to worry about anything. Just show up tomorrow, sign the papers, and it'll all be over." Margaret's words were final. Matter of fact, as if she were discussing something trivial, like selling a piece of old furniture. Clara's head spun. It was as if the ground had been ripped out from under her. How could this be happening? Her mind raced to the worst possible scenarios. Fraud, forgery, lies. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play here. Why was Margaret so determined? Why was she acting as though everything was already settled? Clara's hands shook as she set the phone down on the counter, still unable to process the reality of the situation. The Dacha had always been a safe haven, a place where Clara and Daniel had found peace and solitude. And now it was being ripped away from her, without her say. Clara paced the kitchen, her thoughts a whirlwind of panic and frustration. She had to tell Daniel. He needed to know what was happening. He needed to help her figure out what they were going to do. With a quick breath, she stormed into their bedroom, waking Daniel from his sleep. He groggily rubbed his eyes as she shook his shoulder. When he finally opened his eyes and saw the look on her face, his expression shifted from drowsiness to concern. "Clara." "What's wrong?" Daniel asked, his voice still thick with sleep. "Your mother." "She's selling the Dacha. She's already taken money from the buyers and wants me to sign the papers tomorrow at the notary. She says it's already a done deal," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words spilling out in a rush as she tried to make sense of it all. Daniel sat up abruptly, his face a mix of confusion and disbelief. "What? That's insane. She can't do that. The Dacha is in your name. It's yours." "Clara, she doesn't have the right to sell it." Clara nodded, feeling the anger rise in her chest again. "I know. I told her that. But she just brushed me off, like it didn't matter. She even said she's already taken an advance payment. What if she's forged something? What if she's lying? She's always been controlling. But this is beyond anything she's ever done before." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his brow furrowing. "This doesn't make sense. Margaret's never been this reckless. There has to be more to this. We need to figure out what's going on. And fast. Let's go to the Dacha today. We need to see if there's anything there that can give us a clue about what she's been planning." Clara agreed without hesitation. Her mind was racing with worry, her heart pounding in her chest. The Dacha wasn't just a property, it was her history, her sanctuary. The thought of losing it, especially to Margaret, felt like a betrayal too deep to comprehend. But she wasn't going to let this happen. She couldn't. The drive to the Dacha was long, the familiar road stretching before them. But it now felt more like a path to a battlefield than a peaceful retreat. Clara's stomach was in knots, but she didn't let it show. Daniel kept glancing over at her, concern written all over his face. When they finally arrived at the Dacha, the sight of the old cottage took Clara's breath away. The wildflowers still swayed in the breeze. The oak tree where she and Daniel had carved their initials stood, strong and sturdy as ever. It looked like a safe haven, the same place she had spent so many happy moments in, but now it felt like something was wrong. There was an uneasy weight in the air, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Inside, everything appeared normal at first glance. The mismatched furniture in the cozy living room, the kitchen where Clara had made so many memories with her grandmother, the stairs creaking softly as they led up to the loft bedroom. But as Clara walked through the house, an unsettling sense crept over her. Something wasn't right. "Daniel, look at this!" Clara called from the kitchen, holding up a small stack of papers she had found hidden behind a drawer. Daniel walked over, his eyes scanning the papers as he took them from her. "These are real estate listings," he said, his voice growing more serious as he read through the descriptions and price tags. "She's been planning this for months." This isn't just some impulsive decision. Clara's heart dropped. She felt betrayed, like the ground beneath her had shifted yet again. But why? What's her real reason for doing this? She's never hinted at needing money, and now she's selling our family's property. It doesn't make sense. Daniel's jaw tightened as he sifted through the papers, his mind racing. "I don't know, but we're not signing anything tomorrow. We need to stop her." Clara wiped her eyes, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. She wasn't going to let Margaret take the Dacha from her, not without a fight. The thought of losing the cottage, a piece of her heritage, was unbearable, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something deeper that Margaret wasn't telling them. And Clara would get to the bottom of it, no matter what it took. The drive back to the city that evening was filled with tension. The silence between Clara and Daniel, heavy with unspoken thoughts. As much as Clara tried to concentrate on the road ahead, her mind kept spiraling back to the scene at the Dacha. What was Margaret hiding? How could she betray her like this? The coldness in her mother-in-law's voice still echoed in Clara's head, each word carrying the weight of finality. What's really going on here? "Daniel..." Clara finally broke the silence, her voice soft but edged with frustration. She's been planning this for months, and now she's so sure about everything. It's like she's doing this for some reason we don't understand. What's changed with her? Daniel's fingers tightened on the steering wheel as he glanced at Clara. "I don't know, Clara, but I've been thinking about it, and I can't shake the feeling that there's more to it than just wanting to sell the Dacha. Margaret's never been this reckless, and she's always had control over everything. So why would she suddenly make a move like this without talking to us first? It's like she's acting out of desperation." Clara nodded slowly, her chest tightening. She had always known Margaret to be controlling, even manipulative at times, but this was different. This was more than just her usual overbearing behavior. This was something darker. She had made a move that could change the course of their family forever without a second thought for Clara's feelings or Daniel's stake in the Dacha. When they arrived back at the apartment, Clara immediately called her lawyer friend, Emma, hoping for some clarity. She didn't know if she was hoping for reassurance or a solution, but she needed to understand her legal standing. Emma was a calm, collected professional, someone Clara trusted. She listened patiently as Clara explained the situation, every word dripping with disbelief. "You're right." "Clara," Emma said after a long pause, "Margaret has no legal right to sell the Dacha. It's in your name. And it's protected. If she's already taken money from the buyers and signed documents, it sounds like fraud. If she's forged anything, it could get complicated. But you're in the clear legally. I would suggest you stop the sale immediately. The longer this drags on, the messier it will get." Clara exhaled in relief. That was one weight off her shoulders, but the knot in her stomach didn't loosen. If Margaret was willing to go this far selling the property without asking, taking money from strangers, what was her true motive? There was something more lurking behind this, and Clara was determined to uncover it. Daniel and Clara spent the rest of the evening preparing. They knew they had to be ready for the notary meeting tomorrow, but the uncertainty gnawed at them. Was Margaret truly unaware of the legal boundaries, or was she acting on some kind of hidden agenda? Could she have been pressured into this? If so, by whom? As the night grew late, Clara's mind was a whirlwind of possibilities. She couldn't sleep. Thoughts of Margaret, the Dacha, the buyers, everything blurred together in a fog of worry. She knew tomorrow would be crucial, a turning point in what had already become a nightmare. When morning came, Clara was already awake, the weight of the situation pulling her from sleep. She dressed quickly, her mind focused on the task ahead. She and Daniel were determined to stop the sale, but Clara felt a growing sense of urgency. This wasn't just about property. It was about family, trust, and the life they had built together. The Dacha wasn't just a house, it was a piece of Clara's heart, and Margaret had no right to take it from her. By 9:30 a.m., they arrived at the notary's office, a small building on the outskirts of town. The waiting area smelled of old paper and ink, and the soft murmur of voices from the other rooms only heightened the tension Clara felt in her chest. She could hear the sound of footsteps approaching, and she knew it was time. They walked down a narrow hallway to a small conference room, where they were greeted by the receptionist. When they entered the room, Clara's heart sank. Margaret was already seated at the table, looking composed. A pile of documents in front of her. Beside her sat a middle-aged couple, the buyers. The man had a gentle, almost apologetic expression, while the woman seemed impatient, tapping her fingers on the table, her eyes flickering between Clara and Margaret. As Clara and Daniel took their seats, Margaret didn't even look up. She continued to sort through the papers in front of her, as if nothing was amiss. The tension in the room was palpable. Clara could feel her pulse racing as she stared at her mother-in-law, who had always been so cold, so calculated. Now, more than ever, Clara needed answers. "Margaret," Daniel's voice broke the silence. "What is this? You can't sell the Dacha. It's not yours. It belongs to Clara." For the first time since they had entered the room, Margaret's eyes lifted, her gaze sharp and calculating. But instead of apologizing or offering any explanation, she simply stated, "I've already explained this. Daniel, the sale is happening. Clara just needs to sign the papers, and everything will be finalized. The buyers have already given an advance." Clara felt a wave of frustration flood over her. She couldn't just sit back and let Margaret get away with this. She had to know why. Why was Margaret so intent on selling something that wasn't hers to sell? "I'm not signing anything," Clara said, her voice steady but filled with fury. "The Dacha is mine. You had no right to do this. Margaret, I want to know why you're so desperate to sell it. What's really going on?" Margaret's eyes flickered to the buyers, and for a split second, Clara saw something in her mother-in-law's face, a crack in her carefully crafted composure. It was fleeting, but it was there. Then, Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, and she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I'm not discussing this any further," Margaret snapped. "Clara's being emotional. She'll sign, and everything will be fine." The notary, a balding man in a grey suit, entered the room just in time. He cleared his throat, sensing the tension. "If there's a dispute over ownership, we can't proceed with the signing," he said, glancing between Clara and Margaret. "I'll need to verify the ownership documents." Margaret's face turned pale. Clara saw her hands tighten around the folder in front of her, her nerves starting to show. The notary's comment had hit a nerve. Without another word, Margaret turned sharply and stormed out of the room. Everyone watched in stunned silence. The tension hung in the air as the notary, the buyers, Daniel, and Clara exchanged uneasy glances. Clara stood frozen for a moment, still processing what had just happened. Margaret's abrupt exit left the room heavy with unspoken questions. The buyers exchanged uneasy glances, their faces betraying confusion and frustration. Clara's own heart raced, and she could barely breathe, the weight of the situation pressing on her chest. What was Margaret hiding? Why had she reacted like that? Daniel stood up, his expression one of disbelief mixed with concern. "We need to follow her," he said, his voice firm and urgent. "Something's wrong. She's hiding something, and we need to find out what it is." Clara nodded, her thoughts a whirlwind of anxiety and anger. She wanted to yell, to demand answers from Margaret, but she knew this wasn't the time. They had to be careful. If Margaret had something to hide, and Clara was sure she did, they needed to approach this with caution. So they left the notary's office, walking quickly toward the parking lot where their car was parked. As they stepped outside, Clara noticed that Margaret's car was already pulling out of the lot, without thinking. Daniel jumped into the driver's seat of their car, and they quickly followed her down the winding streets of the town, keeping a safe distance. Clara's stomach twisted as Saki, Ortkats, watched Margaret's silver sedan speed ahead, weaving through traffic as if she had somewhere important to be. "Where is she going?" Clara muttered, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Why is she in such a rush?" "I don't know," Daniel said, his voice tense as he focused on the road. "But we're going to find out." They followed Margaret through the city streets, past the familiar landmarks, until they reached the industrial district. Clara's unease deepened. The area was filled with warehouses and storage units, a far cry from the upscale neighborhoods Margaret usually frequented. This was a part of the city that felt cold and distant, a place where people came to hide, not to be seen. Margaret's car pulled into a small, nondescript parking lot in front of a warehouse with a rusted sign that read, "Storage Solutions." The name seemed almost too fitting. This was a place where secrets could be stored away, far from prying eyes. Clara's heart skipped a beat. What was Margaret doing here? Daniel parked a safe distance away, and they sat in silence for a moment, watching as Margaret got out of her car. She glanced around nervously, her eyes scanning the area before she hurried into the warehouse. Clara's mind raced. There was no reason Margaret, of all people, would be here. The warehouse looked abandoned, desolate, and completely out of place for someone like Margaret, who had always prided herself on maintaining a pristine image. Something was terribly wrong. "Let's go," Daniel said quietly, breaking Clara's train of thought. He had already unbuckled his seatbelt, ready to follow her. Clara hesitated for a moment, fear and uncertainty clouding her mind. But she knew they couldn't let this go. They had to find out what Margaret was involved in. The two of them crept out of the car, moving quickly but quietly toward the warehouse. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the surrounding buildings, the air thick with the smell of oil and rust. They reached the door Margaret had entered, which was slightly ajar, and Clara could hear muffled voices coming from inside, her breath caught in her throat. Who was she talking to, and why was she meeting someone in such a place? They exchanged a look, and without a word, they moved closer, crouching behind a stack of crates near the entrance. Through a small gap in the wall, Clara could just make out Margaret standing in front of a tall fauteuil, broad-shouldered man. He was speaking to her in a low, menacing tone. Clara could barely make out the words, but she could hear the tension in his voice. Whoever he wasn't someone Margaret could afford to upset. "I told you I'm handling it," Margaret said, her voice shaky. "The sale was supposed to go through today, but there's a complication. I just need a little more time." The man didn't seem convinced. "You've had enough time." "Margaret," he growled, his voice low and threatening. "You owe me, if I don't get my money by the end of the week. You know what happens." Clara's stomach dropped. This was the moment the pieces started falling into place. The man's tone was chilling, and Margaret's fear was evident in the way she shifted uncomfortably. What kind of trouble had she gotten herself into? Clara's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't about selling the Dacha. This was about something much bigger, something much more dangerous. "I'll get the money," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Dacha is worth more than enough to cover the debt. I just need to convince Clara to sign the papers. Once I get her to do that, I can pay you off, please. Just give me a little more time." Clara's blood ran cold. The realization hit her like a slap in the face. Margaret wasn't just selling the Dacha out of greed or control. She was doing it to pay off a debt. And this man, Victor, was someone Margaret was terrified of. His threats were real, and the consequences of not paying him were more severe than Clara could have ever imagined. The man, Victor, took a step closer to Margaret, his shadow looming over her. "You better, because if you don't, I'll take more than just the money. I know where you live. I know where your son lives." His words hung in the air, each one heavy with menace. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, trying to stifle a gasp. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Margaret was in debt, deep in debt, to a man who wasn't afraid to use violence to get what he wanted. This wasn't just about money, it was about survival. Victor turned and began to walk away, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Margaret watched him go, her shoulders slumped in defeat. For the first time, Clara saw her mother-in-law not as a controlling, overbearing figure, but as a woman who was terrified, desperate to protect her family, but willing to sacrifice anything to get out of the mess she had created. Margaret pulled out her phone and made a call, her voice barely a whisper. "It's me," she said, her words trembling. "The sale didn't go through. We need to find another way to get the money. I can't let him hurt Daniel." Clara's heart ached. Despite everything, despite the betrayal, Margaret was trying to protect her son. But it was too late to pretend that this was just about money. The danger was real. And now Clara knew that they had to do whatever it took to stop Victor and get Margaret out of this nightmare. Clara stood there in stunned silence, her thoughts racing as she tried to process what she had just overheard. The weight of the situation crashed down on her all at once. Margaret's desperate need to sell the Dacha, her willingness to go behind Clara's back, it was all because of a debt to this man, Victor. A debt so deep and so dangerous that Margaret was willing to sacrifice the family cottage to save herself. And her son, Daniel. Clara turned to Daniel, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and sorrow. She could see the shock mirrored in his expression as well. He hadn't said a word since they had overheard the conversation, but it was clear that the pieces were falling into place for him too. He had known his mother had always been secretive, controlling even, but he never imagined that it could go this far, that she had fallen into something so dark, so criminal, that it threatened everything they held dear. "We can't just let this happen," Daniel finally said, his voice steady, but filled with an undercurrent of anger. "We have to stop her. This man, Victor, he's dangerous. And now he's threatening you. Clara, threatening our family." Clara nodded, the weight of Daniel's words sinking in. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about their safety, about the very real threat of violence hanging over their heads. The Dacha, her grandmother's cottage, had been the symbol of their escape, their sanctuary, but now it felt more like a battleground. "What can we do?" Clara's voice was barely a whisper, a mix of frustration and helplessness. "We know Margaret didn't want us to find out. But what now? We can't just let Victor get away with this. He'll never stop if we don't do something." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small space in the warehouse, his mind working overtime. They couldn't just confront Margaret directly. There had to be a way to outsmart Victor and stop the situation from escalating. We need to get the money, but we also need to make sure Victor doesn't come after us again. We need leverage. Something that will make him back off, once and for all. Clara swallowed hard. The idea of dealing with Victor's threats, making her stomach churn, but she knew Daniel was right. The sale of the Dacha could wait. They needed to stop Victor. They needed to protect their family. The drive back to the apartment was quiet, the silence oppressive as both Clara and Daniel wrestled with their thoughts. They had to come up with a plan. They had no idea what they were up against, but they knew they couldn't face it alone. It was time to bring in help. As soon as they arrived back at the apartment, Clara sat down at the kitchen table, her fingers nervously tapping against the surface. She thought about the phone call she had overheard Margaret making. She needed to act fast before things spiraled even further. She grabbed her phone and called her lawyer friend, Emma, once again, her voice trembling as she explained what had happened. "Emma, I need your help. We can't just stop Margaret from selling the Dacha. We need to find a way to protect ourselves from this man. Victor, he's dangerous, and I'm scared for Daniel's safety. What do we do?" Emma's voice was calm but firm as she reassured Clara. "You're doing the right thing by reaching out. I'll see what I can find on Victor. We might be able to gather some information that could help you. But whatever happens, you need to stay safe. Keep your distance from Margaret and Victor. Don't confront them directly. I'll help you figure out the next steps." Clara ended the call, her mind still racing. She felt a sense of relief that Emma was on their side, but the reality of the situation didn't ease. They were running out of time, and the danger was getting closer with each passing minute. Daniel, who had been quiet during the conversation, finally spoke up. "Clara, I'm going to reach out to Uncle Robert. I know we haven't spoken to him in years, but he's got the means. If anyone can help us get the money to pay off Victor, it's him. I'll explain everything." Clara didn't have to think twice. Uncle Robert was their best shot. He was wealthy, connected, and despite the falling out they had years ago, Clara knew that Robert still cared for Daniel. She could only hope that he would be willing to help them in their hour of need. The next morning, Daniel made the call. He explained the situation to his uncle, not holding back any of the urgency or danger that had overtaken their lives. There was a long silence on the other end. But then Daniel heard Robert's voice, gruff but sincere. "I always knew Margaret would get herself into trouble," Robert said, his tone darkening. "But don't worry, Danny, I won't let anything happen to you. I'll send the money. You'll have it by tomorrow." Clara exhaled in relief. That was one problem solved, at least temporarily. But even with the money in hand, Clara knew the real battle was still ahead. Victor wasn't going to back down just because they paid him off. This was bigger than money. It was about survival. And Victor wasn't the kind of man who could be reasoned with. After the call with Robert, Clara and Daniel sat down with their private investigator, Tom, a man known for his sharp instincts and no-nonsense approach. They briefed him on everything they knew about Victor. And Tom immediately started gathering information. "You've got to be careful with men like him." Tom warned, "Victor's not just some small-time thug. He's got connections, and he's been involved in much darker dealings than you realize. I'll dig into his background, but you need to be prepared. This is going to get messy." Clara nodded, feeling the weight of Tom's warnings sink in. The plan was coming together, but they had to move fast. They had no idea what Victor would do when he realized they were onto him. But Clara knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to just let them walk away. As the day wore on, Clara and Daniel's resolve grew stronger, and they were not going to let Victor or Margaret take away the life they had built. Whatever it took, they were going to fight for their family, for their home, and for the safety of everyone they loved. The days following Daniel's call to Uncle Robert were a blur of activity. each hour weighed down by the pressing reality of what was happening. As Clara paced around their apartment, her mind still spinning from the revelations about Margaret's secret debt, she couldn't shake the fear gnawing at her. They had the money thanks to Robert's unexpected offer, but that wasn't enough. Not by a long shot. Victor was out there, and even with money in hand, they had no guarantee he would walk away quietly. Clara's gut twisted at the thought of him lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. She had no illusions about the kind of man he was. The threats he had made to Margaret were not idle. He was a man who would do whatever it took to get what he wanted. And the truth was, even with the money, they didn't know what Victor would do next. They couldn't afford to sit back and wait. They needed answers, and fast. The phone call from Tom, the private investigator, came early the next morning. Clara and Daniel had been expecting it, but the tension in the air made it feel like the entire world was holding its breath. "I've got some information on Victor." Tom's voice came through, steady but with an edge of urgency. "This guy's got a rap sheet that's a mile-long extortion, assault, even ties to organized crime. But here's the kicker. There's a warrant out for his arrest. This guy's trouble, and he's not someone you want to mess with." Clara's stomach flipped. It wasn't just about the debt anymore. Victor was a criminal, and they were in way over their heads. She thought back to the warehouse, the way Margaret had spoken to him, so small, so afraid. Now Clara understood why. This wasn't just some random thug looking for money. Victor was dangerous, and Margaret had been caught in a deadly web. But Tom's next words gave Clara a flicker of hope. "If you can lure him into a public place, I can tip off the police. With the warrant out for his arrest, we might be able to get him arrested on the spot. It's risky, but it could work. You need to move quickly, though." Clara's heart pounded as she listened. This was the break they needed. If they could get Victor into a public place, with enough evidence, maybe they could take him down before things got worse. The thought of confronting him directly made her blood run cold, but she knew they had no choice. They couldn't let this man continue to threaten their family. Not when they had a chance to stop him. She relayed the plan to Daniel, who was already thinking about the best way to set the trap. They couldn't take any chances. They needed to be smart, to make sure Victor didn't suspect a thing. The risk of trying to corner him was high, but the consequences of doing nothing were even greater. If they didn't act fast, Margaret and everyone else could be in grave danger. The plan was set. Margaret would contact Victor and arrange a meeting. She would tell him that she had the money, $60,000 more than enough to settle the debt. It was a risky move, but they had no choice. Victor was a man who responded to pressure, and they had to use that to their advantage. Clara and Daniel would be nearby, waiting for the signal to alert the police. They couldn't afford any mistakes. The meeting was set for 3 p.m. the following day at a park near the city square. It was a public place, busy, filled with people going about their day. The perfect place for a confrontation. If everything went according to plan, the police would arrive just in time to catch Victor and end this nightmare once and for all. As Clara and Daniel drove to the park the next day, the air felt thick with anticipation. Their plan was set into motion, but the tension was almost unbearable. Every passing minute felt like an eternity. They had the money, they had the support of the police, and they had the element of surprise. But would it be enough? When they arrived at the park, they parked a few blocks away, out of sight but close enough to react. They waited in the car, watching as people strolled past, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, the moment that would change everything. "Do you think it will work?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel. "It has to," Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the anxiety creeping into his own chest. We don't have any other choice. We stop Victor now, or he'll keep coming after us. He'll keep coming after Mom, and we can't let that happen." They waited in silence, the minutes stretching on. The park was crowded with families, joggers, and street vendors selling ice cream and hot dogs. The sound of children laughing and playing in the background. It felt like a strange contrast to the tension building in Clara's chest. The world kept turning, but for her and Daniel, everything was on the edge. At exactly 3 p.m, Victor appeared. His leather jacket was unmistakable, the dark sunglasses shielding his eyes as he walked with a confidence that only a man like him could muster. Clara's heart skipped a beat. There was no mistaking him. This was the man who had put their lives at risk, who had nearly torn their family apart, and now here he was, walking straight into their trap. Margaret was already there, standing near a bench with the check for $60,000 in hand. Her face was pale, her eyes flickering nervously between Clara and Daniel, who were hidden just out of sight. This was it, the moment of truth. Victor walked toward Margaret, his face twisted in a sneer. "I told you to come alone," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "Where's the money?" Margaret didn't hesitate. She held up the check, trying to keep her hands from shaking. "I have it," she said quickly. "It's all here. Take it, and leave us alone." Victor snatched the check from her hand, his eyes scanning it quickly. He didn't seem satisfied, but he tucked it into his jacket anyway. "This better not bounce," he muttered, his voice cold. "If it does, I'll be back, and next time. You won't like what happens." Just as Victor turned to leave, the sound of sirens cut through the air. Clara's heart raced as the police swarmed the park, their blue lights flashing in the afternoon sun. Victor froze for a moment, his expression shifting from smug confidence to panic. He turned to run, but Daniel stepped forward, putting himself between Margaret and Victor, blocking his escape. "Not so fast," Daniel said, his voice firm. Before Victor could react, the police were on him, their guns drawn. The sirens grew louder as officers surrounded Victor, their commands clear and forceful. Clara watched in stunned silence as they handcuffed him and led him away. It was over. Victor was caught. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara allowed herself to breathe. Margaret collapsed onto the nearby bench, her shoulders shaking as the tension finally broke. She had done it. She had helped them stop the man who had threatened them all, but even as the relief washed over her, Clara knew this was just the beginning. The real work had only just begun. The park was suddenly quiet. The chaos of sirens and flashing lights had melted away, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost surreal. Clara and Daniel stood a few steps away from the scene, watching as the police led Victor, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, toward the waiting squad car. The entire situation felt like something out of a nightmare they had just barely escaped from. The weight of it all hung heavily in the air, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that their world had changed forever. Margaret sat on the bench, her face pale and drained, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The tension in her body seemed to melt away. But Clara could see the depth of her exhaustion. This was more than just relief. It was a complicated mix of guilt, fear, and regret. Margaret had made a terrible mistake, and now, for the first time, she had to face the consequences of her actions. Clara approached her cautiously, her heart heavy. The anger she had once felt toward her mother-in-law, the betrayal she had struggled with, seemed to dissipate in the face of the truth. As much as Margaret had wronged them, as much as she had endangered their family, Clara knew that this moment wasn't about punishment, it was about understanding. "Margaret," Clara said quietly, sitting down beside her. "Are you okay?" Margaret's eyes flickered up at Clara, the sorrow in her gaze palpable. She nodded slowly, but there was no mistaking the pain that lingered beneath the surface. "I didn't want you to find out like this," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I could handle it on my own, that I could protect you both. But I see now how badly I've messed up." Clara felt a surge of sympathy, mingled with the anger that had once burned inside her. Margaret wasn't a monster. She was a mother, overwhelmed and cornered by forces she couldn't control. She had made poor decisions, but that didn't change the fact that she had put herself and everyone else in a dangerous situation. The road to redemption, Clara realized, wasn't going to be easy, but it was a road they would have to walk together. "I know you were trying to protect us," Clara said, her voice gentle, "but selling the Dacha, that wasn't the way. Then, you can't just keep everything a secret. Margaret, you have to trust us. We're family." Margaret's lips trembled as tears began to form in her eyes. "I didn't want to burden you," she confessed. "I thought I could fix everything without you knowing. But I couldn't. I lost everything. Clara, my savings, my retirement, everything I worked for. And when I couldn't pay Victor back, I didn't know what else to do. He's dangerous. He threatened Daniel. I was terrified. And I thought selling the Dacha would be the only way to get out of it." Clara's heart ached as she listened to Margaret's story. The woman who had always seemed so cold, so distant, was now revealing the depths of her vulnerability. Margaret wasn't just a schemer. She was a woman who had been pushed to the edge by her own mistakes and by the fear of losing everything she loved. "I understand now," Clara said softly. "But you have to understand something, too. We're a family. Margaret, we need to face these things together. Hiding from the truth, pretending like it doesn't exist, it only makes things worse." Daniel, who had been standing a few feet away, watching the conversation unfold, finally stepped forward. His expression was a mixture of anger, frustration, and sadness. It was clear that he, too, was struggling with the revelation of everything Margaret had kept hidden. But there was something else in his eyes now, a flicker of understanding. "I'm angry, Mom," Daniel said, his voice raw with emotion. "You could have come to us. We could have helped. We would have figured something out. But you didn't give us the chance. You didn't trust us." Margaret's face crumpled as she reached out toward Daniel, her voice shaking. "I'm sorry. I was so ashamed. I thought if you knew, it would destroy everything. But I see now that I was wrong. I was wrong to try to protect you by doing this alone." Daniel hesitated for a moment, looking at his mother, his eyes clouded with the conflicting emotions of betrayal and concern. But then he reached out and took her hand, pulling her into a quiet embrace. "It's not too late," he murmured. "We'll fix this together. But no more secrets." "Okay." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "No more secrets," she agreed, her voice barely a whisper. The weight of that moment hung in the air. It was the beginning of something new, something fragile, but filled with the potential for healing. Margaret had made a devastating mistake, but she was willing to face the consequences and make things right. Clara wasn't sure how long it would take for their family to heal from this ordeal. But she knew that with time, they would get there. Together, as they sat there in the park, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. Clara's thoughts turned to the Dacha. The cottage that had once seemed like an impossible loss was now, once again, part of their future. But Clara knew it wouldn't be enough just to keep the property. They needed to rebuild the trust that had been broken, not just between Margaret and herself, but between all of them. Clara turned to Daniel, her hand resting gently on his. "We'll figure this out," she said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. It's not just about the Dacha. It's about our family. We've been through so much, but I know we can make it work. Daniel smiled faintly, squeezing her hand. Yeah, we will. As they stood up and walked toward their car, a sense of calm settled over Clara. The worst was behind them. Victor was gone. And Margaret was finally facing her demons. But the future was still uncertain. And Clara knew there would be more challenges ahead. The road to healing was long, but with each step, they were a little closer to finding peace, together. The ride back to the apartment was quiet, filled with the hum of the engine and the occasional glance exchanged between Clara, Daniel, and Margaret. The events of the day had unfolded like something out of a bad dream. But now, in the aftermath, it felt surreal to be driving home with the weight of it all beginning to settle in. The immediate danger had passed. Victor was in custody. His threat neutralized, but Clara knew the real work was just beginning. Margaret's confession had opened a door that could no longer be closed, and everything that followed would require patience, understanding, and a great deal of rebuilding. Clara glanced over at Daniel, his face still tense, but more relaxed now, as if the confrontation with Victor had finally allowed some of the tension to release. Yet, Clara could see the remnants of frustration lingering behind his eyes. The traces of betrayal still raw, though softened by the moments of reconciliation they had just shared with his mother. "We need to talk," Clara said softly, breaking the silence in the car. "About what happens next." Daniel nodded, his hand tightening around the steering wheel. "I know. It's not just about fixing things with Margaret anymore. We've got a lot of healing to do. And I think we both know that." Clara sighed, feeling a lump rise in her throat. "I'm scared. Daniel, I'm scared that everything has changed, that it will never be the same. I want things to go back to the way they were, but I know that's not possible now. We've seen too much, learned too much. And I don't know if I can trust her again, even if she says she's sorry." Daniel reached over, taking her hand gently. "I know. Clara, I'm scared too, but we can't change what happened. We can only move forward. And moving forward means dealing with all of it, no more secrets, no more lies. We need to be honest with each other, no matter how painful it is, her." Clara squeezed his hand in return, feeling comforted by his steady presence. But the uncertainty was still there, gnawing at the edges of her mind. How could they rebuild the trust that had been shattered? How could they move on from something so deep, so personal? They arrived back at the apartment, and Margaret, who had been quiet during the drive, looked up at them, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and uncertainty. Her shoulders were slumped, and her eyes held the same deep sadness they had when they first confronted her. But there was something different in her eyes now, a flicker of hope. Maybe. Or perhaps just the beginning of an understanding that things couldn't go back to how they were before. Margaret stood as they entered the apartment, wringing her hands nervously. "I know I've hurt you both, and I'm so sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I hope that one day we can move past this. I don't want to lose my family." Clara and Daniel exchanged a look, and for a moment, neither of them knew what to say. The words felt heavy, too heavy for this moment. But Clara finally broke the silence, her voice soft but firm. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Margaret, but I do know that we can't move forward unless we're honest with each other from now on. No more hiding things, no more trying to protect each other with lies. We have to face everything together." Margaret nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I understand. Clara, I should have trusted you both. I should have told you the truth from the beginning. But I was scared, And I thought if I handled it on my own, I could fix everything without you getting hurt. But I see now how wrong I was." Daniel stepped forward, his face a little softer now, though the tension hadn't completely left his eyes. "We can start over." "Margaret, but it's going to take time. We can't just forget what happened, and I need to know that I can trust you again. That we can all trust each other. That's the only way we'll move forward." "For a moment." Margaret was silent, her shoulders trembling as if the weight of her past mistakes were finally breaking through. Then, with a shaky breath, she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "I will do whatever it takes to earn your trust. Daniel and Clara. I'm sorry, I was trying to protect you, but in doing so, I only pushed you away. I'll do better. I promise." Clara looked at her mother-in-law, her expression softening just a little. She still felt a knot in her chest, but she also felt a glimmer of something else. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the beginning of healing. She didn't know yet. But she knew that for their family to move forward, they all had to make a choice to confront the past and let go of the lies. "I'm not sure what happens next," Clara said, her voice filled with a mixture of vulnerability and determination. "But I'm willing to try. For Daniel. For us. We'll figure it out together, but we have to do it the right way. No more secrets." Margaret wiped her eyes and nodded. "I'll be here. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." As the three of them stood there, the weight of the past still hanging in the air, Clara couldn't help but wonder if they had just taken the first step towards something new. The road ahead was uncertain, and the scars from this ordeal would take time to heal. But there was a new understanding between them, a promise to rebuild what had been broken. It wasn't going to be easy, and Clara wasn't sure how long it would take, but she knew they had made a choice. They had chosen to face the truth, to forgive when possible, and to move forward together as a family. The Dacha, once a symbol of peace and sanctuary, had become a symbol of their struggle, a place where they would find not just solace, but the strength to rebuild. And as Clara stood there, surrounded by the people she loved, she realized that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance at healing. The days that followed the confrontation were filled with a delicate mixture of silence and tentative conversations. Clara, Daniel, and Margaret were slowly trying to find a new rhythm, one that didn't feel quite as strained, though the air between them was still thick with the aftermath of the lies and secrets that had surfaced. There was no simple fix for what had happened, no magic word or gesture that would instantly restore trust. But they were trying. At least, that's what Clara kept telling herself. The Dacha was safe. For now. The sale had been stopped, the buyers refunded, and the paperwork officially cancelled. Clara had spent hours going over every detail and every document to make sure nothing was left behind, nothing hidden, but even with the cottage secure, something inside Clara still felt unsettled. She kept circling back to Margaret's words about her involvement with Victor, the way she had been manipulated, trapped by her own choices, until she was cornered into doing the unthinkable. Victor's arrest was a small victory, but Clara knew it wasn't the end, not by a long shot. There were still questions lingering in the air, and some of them were too painful to ask aloud. Who was Victor really? How deep did Margaret's financial trouble go? And what else had been hidden in the shadows? Clara had no choice but to dig deeper. As much as she wanted to turn away from the mess Margaret had created, the questions that remained would continue to haunt her if she didn't face them head on. One afternoon, while Daniel was out, Clara found herself sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of old bills and receipts Margaret had reluctantly handed over. She could see the way Margaret's hands shook as she passed the documents to her, as if each paper held more shame than the last. But Clara wasn't looking for a way to punish Margaret. She just needed answers. Answers that could give her peace of mind. Answers that might explain how they had found themselves in this situation in the first place. As she flipped through the documents, a few things caught her attention. There were multiple loans, small ones at first, each showing a steady increase in amounts over time. Then, the last entry, a large sum, far bigger than anything else, stood out like a scar on the page. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she saw the creditor's name. It wasn't a bank or a loan agency. It was a name she didn't recognize at first, but when she Googled it, her stomach twisted. The name on the loan was tied to an illegal lending syndicate, something far more dangerous than just a bad investment or a few misplaced bets. This was the kind of organization that operated in the shadows, making deals that were as much about intimidation as they were about money. The realization hit Clara like a cold wave. Margaret had been in over her head for far longer than she had let on. This wasn't just a matter of a few poor decisions or a gambling addiction. It was something more sinister and much more terrifying. Clara's mind raced. How could Margaret have gotten involved with people like this? She had to know it wasn't safe, that it wasn't a situation she could control. The more Clara read through the papers, the more the picture of desperation became clear. Margaret had been trying to cover up her mistakes, hide them from her family. But the weight of the debt she had accumulated had finally caught up with her. The Dacha had been her last hope. And the attempt to sell it wasn't just a financial decision. It was a way out, even if it meant breaking the law. Clara put the papers down, her hands shaking. She needed to confront Margaret. There was no more hiding from the truth. The lies had gone on long enough. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara and Daniel sat down with Margaret in the living room, the tension palpable. Clara knew that this conversation would be difficult, but it was necessary. Margaret had tried to shield them from the full extent of her involvement, but now the truth was spilling out. There was no more pretending. "Margaret," Clara began, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. "I found the loans, the ones you didn't tell us about. I know about the syndicate, and I know that's who you've been dealing with. I need to know everything. Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you trust us enough to ask for help?" Margaret looked at Clara, her face a mix of guilt and fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated, struggling to find the right words. After a long moment of silence, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want you to know," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "I thought I could fix it on my own. I thought I could get the money and get out of it without anyone finding out, but I didn't realize how deep I was in. I didn't want you to hate me. Clara, I thought I could protect you, protect Daniel, but I see now. I see how wrong I was." Clara felt a pang of sorrow, but it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of everything Margaret had hidden. "You have to understand, Margaret. We can't help you if you don't let us in. You don't have to protect us like this. We're your family. We want to help." Margaret nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. I know now. But it's too late to undo everything. I'm in too deep, and I'm scared. I've made so many mistakes, and I don't know if I can fix them." Clara sat beside her, her hand resting gently on Margaret's. "It's not too late. But we need to deal with this together. We need to go to the authorities. We need to get out from under this. Once and for all, you're not alone anymore." Margaret's eyes filled with tears again. But this time, there was a faint glimmer of relief. "You really mean it? You'll help me, after everything I've done?" "Of course," Clara said, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "We'll get through this, together, but it starts with you being honest. No more hiding. It wasn't going to be easy." The road ahead was filled with more uncertainty and pain. But Clara knew that facing the truth, no matter how ugly or frightening, was the only way forward. They had taken the first step toward healing their family. And while the path was still unclear, they were ready to walk it together. The days following their conversation with Margaret were tense, yet filled with a strange kind of hope. Clara knew that the road ahead would be challenging. But for the first time, there was a sense of purpose in their actions. The secrets were out, and though the truth was difficult to swallow, it had been a necessary step. Margaret had agreed to go to the authorities to finally face the consequences of her choices. And Clara wasn't sure if this would be the beginning of her redemption or just another painful chapter. But what mattered now was that they were moving forward. Clara and Daniel knew it wasn't just about Margaret. This was about them, too. The trust between them, though fragile, had been tested in ways they could never have imagined. They had been forced to confront their own fears, their own insecurities, and the realization that family, no matter how fractured, could still heal if given the right attention. They weren't perfect, but they were together, and that had to be enough for now. The following week was a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, consultations with law enforcement, and visits to the authorities to turn over evidence that could help them in their case against Victor and the syndicate. Margaret's cooperation was crucial, and while Clara could sense the shame that weighed on her mother-in-law, she also saw something else in Margaret's eyes, a determination to make things right. It wasn't going to be easy, but at least Margaret was no longer trying to carry the burden alone. One evening, after another long day of paperwork and phone calls, Clara and Daniel sat down in their cozy apartment, both exhausted but relieved. Margaret had spent most of the day meeting with the authorities, and Clara could tell the process had been grueling, but there was also a lightness to Margaret now, a small glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. She was finally letting go of the weight she had carried for so long. "I'm proud of you," Clara said quietly, as they sat together on the couch. "For doing this, for facing everything head-on." Daniel nodded, his hand resting on her knee. It wasn't easy, but it was the right thing to do. We couldn't have moved forward without it. Clara leaned against him, feeling the warmth of his embrace. "I know, it's still hard to believe how deep everything went, but I think we're starting to understand. Margaret, she made terrible decisions, but she was also trying to protect us in her own way. It wasn't perfect, but I see why she did what she did." Daniel sighed, his fingers gently brushing through her hair. "Yeah, I get it. It still stings. Though, it's hard not to feel angry about it, but I think we're starting to come to terms with it. We've got to focus on what's ahead, not just the past." Clara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the stillness of the room sink in. She thought about the Dacha, their family's cottage, the symbol of so many memories, and yet it had also become a symbol of the pain and betrayal they had endured. But now, with the weight of the past beginning to lift, Clara knew that the Dacha could once again be a place of healing, a place for them to rebuild, together. The following weekend, Clara and Daniel decided to return to the Dacha for the first time since everything had unfolded. They had avoided it for weeks, unsure of how it would feel to be there after everything that had happened. But now, they were ready to confront the place that had once been a sanctuary, the place that had almost been lost. As they drove down the familiar road, Clara felt the weight of the past months lifting. If only just a little. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and the countryside stretched out before them like a wide, welcoming embrace. It felt like a fresh start, the beginning of a new chapter for them all. When they arrived at the cottage, Clara's heart skipped a beat. It was just as she remembered, old but full of character. Its wooden walls worn with age but strong. The wildflowers still swayed in the breeze, and the old oak tree stood tall, its branches reaching toward the sky. Clara smiled as she stepped out of the car. the familiar scent of fresh earth and grass filling her lungs. This was the place where so many of her happiest memories had been made, and she knew that, no matter what had happened, it would always hold a piece of her heart. Daniel joined her, and together, they walked toward the front door. As they stepped inside, Clara felt a wave of nostalgia wash over her. The cottage hadn't changed much. The mismatched furniture was still there. The creaky stairs still led up to the loft, and the kitchen still held the comforting scent of old wood and herbs. But now, there was something new in the air, something that had been absent for far too long. Peace. This place, Clara murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, isn't just a house. It's our history. It's the one thing that's always been there for us, through everything. Daniel wrapped his arm around her, and it always will be. We'll make sure of it. Clara looked out the window, where the sun was setting over the fields of wildflowers, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange. It was beautiful, peaceful, like everything was beginning to make sense again. Margaret joined them later that day, looking a little more relaxed, a little more herself. The burden of the past wasn't entirely gone, but it was lifting, piece by piece. As she stepped onto the porch and looked out over the land, Clara saw something she hadn't seen in a long time: hope, real hope. The kind that could only come from surviving something so difficult and coming out the other side stronger. "I'm sorry for everything." "Clara," Margaret said quietly, her voice full of emotion, "but I promise I'll do better. I'll never put you through something like this again. You deserve more than I gave you, and I'm willing to spend the rest of my life making it right." Clara nodded, feeling the weight of those words sink in. "We'll get there. But it has to be a new beginning. For all of us." The three of them stood together in the warm light of the setting sun. The promise of a new start hanging in the air. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But Clara knew one thing for sure no matter what the future held. They were ready to face it together.